All right. Well, welcome, Brent James. I am absolutely delighted that you could join me today. It's so, I don't know whether it's just good luck or good management or a lovely or a really great address book, but you are about to be interviewed in the perfect time for us. So I'm just so pleased you could do it. And I'll tell you why. So I'm just going to share this screen, and we've just been doing a survey, Brent, of the NHS about, we've come through the sort of worst potentially, and what we're finding is that as we emerge out of the worst, we're starting to see what is it that we'd really like to keep, and what do we never want to see again. And what's absolutely fascinating about what we want to keep is the things that people want to keep are things like amazing teamwork, the fact that we check in with people, the fact that we peer review our work, the fact that as a professional, I can call another professional and get advice when I need it. The fact that I'm now allocated to a ward, I'm not a safari doctor. The light touch regulation, the fact that I'm being trusted for my clinical expertise, that I've got some sense of control about decision making. I can get the data I want. Data sharing agreements have suddenly been produced that were never possible. I'm clear on my purpose. We've got a different relationship with patients and local people. They are both gifting and also taking more responsibility, and we're letting them take that. There's better well-being of staff. We've got 24/7 food. We haven't had 24/7 food in hospitals for years. And so, Brent, the sort of perfect storm of having booked you for this interview today is that all of the things that I'm seeing that people want to keep are all the things that you led in Intermountain years ago. You know, data-enabled decision-making, professional practice, variation, and only inspecting unwarranted variation. And so I can't believe the luck that this is happening now. But what really struck me is that what we've managed to generate in the NHS for some of our population, not for everybody because we're leaving people behind, but for some of our population, we have managed to generate a high-performing health system almost overnight. And so given that you ran a high-performing health system, it's just great that maybe you could talk to us about how do we go from that being a temporary to a more sustained model. But Brent, not everybody will know who you are. I put up a little bio just now. So maybe as a good friend and colleague over many years, you would perhaps like to just say something about yourself as well before we start questions.
Well, the first thing you need to know, I trained originally in surgical oncology. I was at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, but it was so long ago, it no longer counts. It's been 30 years since I've been in an operating theater. So don't expect me to be a real doctor in the sense of hands-on. I maintain my medical license, which is mostly a demonstration of the limitations of licensing procedures, you see. So I'm not practicing every day, so I'm really not up to speed on the daily reality of clinical practice today. I shifted my focus some years ago into quality research. Technically, my main affiliation at the moment is Stanford University. I'm in the Clinical Excellence Research Center at the Department of Medicine at Stanford University. I commute from Salt Lake. There's funny stories about that too. I teach here at the University of Utah. I'm a member of the National Academy of Medicine. My real interest, though, as I listened to what you had to say, Becky, you're describing a model based upon shared professional values as a means of governance, as opposed to a top-down model of top-down control, regulation and control as a means of delivering care. And I think you're seeing the predictable fruits of that approach, certainly what we saw. What happened, at least here in the United States, those in power misdiagnosed the problem. We get scandals too, as you have had occasionally. We get care that should be better. I mean, it's legitimate that people should say, given all that we're investing, what are we getting? The idea of a focus on quality is entirely legitimate. And we, as you, occasionally have failures along the way. But in the face of the failures, they misdiagnose the problem. Turns out what the evidence base very clearly shows is the problem is complexity. David Eddy was the fellow at Stanford University many years ago who really was the intellectual father of evidence-based medicines. Others like Sackett in Great Britain popularized it broadly, probably a far more important role, and of course contributed to science as well. Eddy said it this way. He said, the complexity of modern medicine exceeds the capacity of the unaided expert mind. And then he proceeded to prove that technically. That was the key to our successes here. How do you deal with complexity? So just assume that those clinicians are really, really smart. They are. They're amazingly dedicated to their patients. It's not a matter of motivation. They're hugely hardworking. They make the rest of society look like a bunch of pikers. I mean, they show up every day, all day. They put their whole heart and mind into it, you see. Well, the idea that we somehow have to motivate them or control them in that setting just doesn't fit. It's a classic misdiagnosis, fairly self-serving misdiagnosis, by the way. I spent a career trying to make it easy for my colleagues to do it right. And it was all around that complexity problem. Now, we have another name for that today. One name is evidence-based medicine, a name that I find far more useful in exploring the problem is clinical quality improvement. It's actually process management science where you start to organize practice in a particular way to make it possible to learn from every patient, to generate formal knowledge from every patient, and at the same time, to apply that knowledge consistently to every patient who needs it. You see? Oh, you've anticipated me, Becky. Did you ever get it right? Yeah, Deming's first premise, he pointed out that all human work, all human enterprises, including practice of medicine, nursing, all the elements of clinical care can be described as processes. So it's a fundamental underlying science. Well, if you accept that premise, that all value-added human work happens through these things called processes. Very simple definition, by the way. A process is just a series of linked steps designed to cause some set of outcomes to occur. You can start with that very simple premise. One of the key things, though, if you really believe that, you've got Deming's first premise at the top of the slide. You organize literally everything around value-added frontline work processes. In this case, most patients come to us with a clinical problem. So management of type 2 diabetes mellitus is technically a process. Management of acute myocardial infarction, AMI, is technically a process. Management of a normal pregnancy, labor and delivery, technically a process, if you see the idea. I will admit it's complex, but you can generalize it. So that's the first thing we really showed. It's based around a seeming oxymoron. The key to effective variation is standardization. Now, I argue that this has actually been an underlying principle, not often appreciated explicitly, but an underlying principle of clinical practice for at least 200 years. In fact, it's one of the keys to our long-term success. It really is. If you look across the sweep of medical history, we've routinely taken areas of new science, worked out how they should work, and then when you standardize them, it takes them off your plate. That's what happens. An example, when I was a youngster, actually practicing medicine every day, did a fair bit of medical evacuation here in the mountains of the U.S. Western states. Yeah, you very often would have somebody on a helicopter or on an airplane, a fixed-wing aircraft, traveling thousands of kilometers to bring them into medical care. But you had to ventilate them, and we used something called a bird ventilator. I had to know how to field strip a bird ventilator that stopped working. So you'd have an assistant ambu bag the patient, and then you'd strip this thing down, clean all the parts, put it all back together, get him back on the ventilator. Could you imagine doing that to a modern ventilator? Yeah. Silly, isn't it? Yeah. What we've done is taken all of that science and built it into the machine. Another word for standardization in the extreme is automation. You see the idea? It's automation. And that's what we've done with ventilation and 1,000 other things too. What it means is I don't have to spend my most important resource, a trained expert mind, that trained clinician. I can focus my attention on other things that are more centrally important because I've taken those things off the plate. They call it mass customization in quality theory. but it's the idea that the key to effective variation is standardization. Now, the variation piece doesn't go away. You know, I know, anybody who's ever practiced knows no two patients are ever exactly the same. I joke around about my training way back in the 70s in surgical practice. I was trained to do it the same way every time. It made me faster. I could actually build complexity into the workflow. I didn't forget things because if we're at this point, this is what we do next. In many of those cases, I expected to reach my hand back and have my scrub tech slap the right instrument in my hand, usually without a word being said, because we'd standardized our process and it was considered to be somewhere near the top of good practice, good medicine, you see. Well, did I have to vary for every patient? Of course. No two patients were ever exactly the same. It's easy to see surgically always small anatomic variations, sometimes fairly dramatically large. Let's just say if you're taking out a gallbladder, you better know where the cholecystic artery is. That thing is not very deterministic. It's kind of highly variable. And if you manage to cut through it, it's going to be really exciting for a few minutes, you see. Well, what we proved basically, the way I like to say it is in applying standard work, I can't write a protocol. I can't write a guideline that perfectly fits any patient. And doctor, that's why we have you. Nurse, same mandate. Therapist, yeah, you get to play this game too. What I need is a thinking mind. You take the standard work and then you adapt it to each patient. Now we did that, and we did it quite broadly. We did it across every aspect of clinical practice, right down to things like surgical pathology, for heaven's sakes. Every aspect of practice. We showed that as the variation dropped, two things happened. The first is we showed dramatically better clinical outcomes. The second thing we showed is a fairly dramatic reduction in cost. Oh, that was Deming's second premise. He basically proved it's basically a mathematical proof that in many circumstances, not all, as you improve the quality of your output, it causes your cost of operations to drop. You know, I've got something of a name here in the US for playing with that one. We ran I'm a member of the National Academy of Medicine, as I mentioned. Back then we called it Institute of Medicine. We called together the experts to look at waste in healthcare. The definition of waste that we used was exactly that I just described. Waste happens when you have a quality failure. Our one-line soundbite summary of our report is a big report, 800 pages down to one line. It's pretty good. We said that a minimum of 30% and probably over 50% of all resources spent in healthcare delivery is waste of that category. Truth in advertising, when I model it, I get about 65% waste. I have worked enough in NHS England and NHS Scotland to strongly believe that your waste levels are as high as mine.
And I think
what would it mean?
When we looked at the survey, I mean, what people have said, of course, is we're getting to make decisions quicker. We don't have to do, discharge is easy. We don't have to fill in masses of forms. We have proper conversations with families. We get the multidisciplinary team in early. I suppose, Brent, it's how have we got to a situation where what you're saying about, effective clinical decision making based on need, based on evidence, with peer review and scrutiny, how do we lose that here? And how, now that it's re-emerged, because it's definitely re-emerged around COVID, the learning systems have been amazing, the multidisciplinarity of decision making, what doctors, and particularly doctors, but also therapists and nurses have loved, have they been able to talk as clinicians about the best evidence to use in this situation with their patients? How do we embed that as that being the new normal, I suppose?
Yeah. So a couple of ideas around that. It's a really hard question, as you understand. It's not just you. What you just described is true around the world.
Yeah.
In every circumstance I've ever seen, certainly true here.
Yeah.
We all suffer under its burden. What I sometimes like to say is when we come together as professionals, no one else can beat us. But it means we have to come together.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean,
that's
one of the bits of feedback actually was, it's so nice to be working with professionals from other specialities trying to solve a problem together. We don't ever talk. And that, I think, is a product of being too busy. And, the usage, the capacity, you know, we're running at 100% all the time. So the capacity issue means there hasn't been the headroom, but there's also been some retreating, I think, of professional practice, and almost not giving up, but almost, you know, the decisions are now being made somewhere else. I need to just do this bit. You know, you can't, general practice in this country has been revolutionized. Triage, remote triage everywhere. It should have happened years ago. It's been a real struggle to get people to change to do that. So how do we ensure that people remember and value that you took responsibility, you made great decisions based on evidence, you put in practices with your patients. Don't give that away again.
Yeah, so a couple of ideas.
Yeah.
I think that your experience during COVID and my experience in Intermountain 20 years ago, in one way, are very, very similar. I didn't ask permission.
Yeah.
All right? I really didn't. I thought of myself as kind of flying under the radar, you know. I went and did what was right without asking permission. If I'd asked permission, it never would have moved. You see? What's happening with you in COVID, you're describing a circumstance in which people have taken the bit in their teeth, they've taken the reins in their own hands, and they're leading the change, aren't they? Now, it turns out that in doing that, there are a series of tools. There's a scientific discipline to do it right. It's the same thing you teach in Great Britain that I teach here in the United States. You see, it really works a lot better if you apply the discipline, and it makes it defensible.
Yeah.
One of the things that I hope will happen is people get this idea that as professionals working together, they can take control of this situation. They should not wait for permission. Now, they need to do it in a how to say it, a careful, thoughtful, scientific, what will you say, responsible way. So it's defensible. And by the way, I'm making it sound way too hard. It's kind of fun to apply that science. It makes it work better. It makes you more successful. So why wouldn't you? But to partner together with other health professionals about best care. That idea of standardization. Now, we called them care process models. We called them protocols. And we would align the data to them. It's a form of patient-centered care, technically, because patients come to us with problems. What if we put the patient at the center of our practice as opposed to the building or physician schedule or other things like this? And what happened is a bunch of us just kind of went off and did it. And then because we were applying a sound methodology, we had pretty good data. And the data showed not just better clinical outcomes. That's your first goal, of course. It showed more efficient operations, lower cost, you see. And then we kind of slapped that down on the table and said, there you go, let's do some more. And that gave us the argument. Now, I think what you're actually fighting about, there are many different descriptions of it. Here in the US, we call it Taylorism. It's the idea that the smart people rise up in the ranks, right? And you get this hierarchy. It's like a social hierarchy where the smart people are up at the top there somewhere, and us poor dumb, you know, serfs are down at the bottom. The top people, they think, and then the management becomes three questions under a Tayloristic model. Number one, how do you move the thinker's ideas into the worker's hands? Number two, how do you get compliance with the orders given to them? And number three, you have to motivate that frontline. They're kind of malingerers, you know. How do you motivate them? You see, to what degree have I just described your experience of the old healthcare delivery system?
The piece that people are saying about leadership, which is no surprise, but sort of heartbreaking, is they're saying, I feel like our leaders are coming down asking us, how are we? How are we doing? What do we need? They said, no one's ever done that. People, they don't come here. They don't talk to us about anything. Including, have you got food and water? Do you need a break? How are you feeling? And they said, this is something that it's just, it's like we were just the worker bees.
So what principles can you take out of this experience that will continue to inform you moving forward? You see, there's some true principles you're talking about here, aren't there? One of the things you just told me is who are the real leaders? Where's the leadership in NHS England? And the answer is it's every physician, every nurse.
Yeah.
You can't allocate leadership just to the top. Now, I realize human nature, everybody likes to be the king. Everybody likes to play God, right?
And
This
some of
is a
that,
different
honestly,
form of
Brent,
leadership.
some of that is stuff that the professions also gave up, you know. So why don't we have 24/7 access to specialists? Well, because they want to go home to bed and they want to have the weekend. You know, there has been some, you know, in some of the contractual arrangements as we got into this, you know, as people felt like I'm just the worker bee, then maybe I don't need to be around so much. So I think there's some stepping up that's taken place, and it's been phenomenally rewarding for folk, and they're starting to remember this is what I loved about being a great clinician. It wasn't just my patient, it was being part of a team, it was being part of a high performing system. It was us all doing well, not just me doing well.
You're describing a professional, a true professional, as opposed to an hourly worker.
Yeah.
Remember what we committed to when we entered these professions?
Yeah.
There's a reason we call them professions, by the way. And it's so affirming. It builds your soul. Mm. You live a life and you leave a legacy that's worthy of admiration. Mm. It gives meaning to your life.
Mm. Yeah.
You're not just in it for the hourly wage. You see, you're in it for the lives that you change, and that's why we all came into this profession. These professions.
I was talking to somebody, and she said, you know, there's as you may do, there's a lot of clapping for the NHS, and it's tinged because people are feeling you're clapping, but I really need the PPE. But there is, there was a nurse I was talking to, she said, I'm not just a nurse anymore, I'm a nurse. And she said, I feel like I'm just a proper, you know, and that's societal. That's how we have undervalued collectively people that do pain, sickness, suffering, and death. We've treated that as something not very pleasant, rather than, you know, the lifeblood of our society. So it's partly how we do it.
I think you had to take care of that. You know, a couple of ideas about that, Becky. Dr. Deming used to talk heavily about joy in work.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. The second is an observation. I've spent a fair bit of time in NHS England and Scotland, and I've observed a particular thing. It's the mindset or the attitude of most of the clinicians I meet. They are professionals who are trying to live that ethic, right? That's what brought them into medicine, care delivery. And in some sense, it really is their heart commitment. At the same time, it's this attitude toward those guys up there who are controlling the system, if you see what I mean. And I've seen that. I know your hearts are true. I've seen it so often. Well, what this has done is given you the freedom to act without asking permission in a reasonable, professional way. I mean, it's not like you're going to go rob the bank or abuse someone. You're using that freedom for true good. You're doing it in a professional setting where you have peers to help you stay on the proper path, if you see what I mean. You're accountable to your peers and to your patients before you're accountable to the government. And that's the right of it. That's what we're supposed to be.
So
that's what we were created to be.
So I think, so one of the, you know, conversations we often have, and I've, you know, tried to have a lot here, as some of people who follow the blog know, which is that means you need data. You need to understand what's really going on. You need to be open to scrutiny from your peers. You need to be confident in your practice. You need space to think, you know, and those are things that you can require and ask for, but you can also build into your daily life and schedule. It's still in your gift to do that.
Yeah, so, you know, that's a great entree. Some years ago, you're familiar with it, Don Berwick and Molly Coy and I published a little article in a journal called Medical Care. And we laid out two different approaches to measurement. One we called selection, the other we called improvement or change, right? For selection, your aim is to rank the players, rank the physicians, rank the hospitals. So your aim is to assess, to choose wisely among the various players and to hold people accountable. You want knowledge about performance. Your target audience, as you've listed on the slide, consumers of various sorts, really Purchasers, that would be the government funding the care, and in some circumstances, if it's private medicine, it might be someone else. The regulators, contractors, the citizens eventually. Well, that's the left-hand side. The right-hand side is really all about innovation and change, improvement, in other words, and it turns out the aims of measurement change dramatically. Your aim is to make the processes of care transparent to those who execute them. So you need knowledge about process and results, and you've listed it correctly. Your target audience is care delivery organizations, more particularly, especially the practitioners, the care delivery teams. So it's a definition of transparency, two different definitions. We actually studied this at the Institute of Medicine, two different definitions. One is transparency from an external view, so that you can evaluate performance from the external view. That's the left-hand selection view, about judgment and choice, pathway one. The other view, do the clinicians at the front line need transparency as to what's happening under their care? Now, one of the big mistakes that people make, there's a couple of really interesting implications of this that were part of the article. The assumption somehow is as if you invest all of your resources in knowledge about performance, that will motivate the right-hand side to make necessary changes. It will allow patients to vote with their feet or people to make wiser selections. But they don't think about transparency at the front lines on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
They're completely oblivious to it. When I say that the core problem is complexity, what I'm saying is the core problem is transparency on the right-hand side. Now, here's the funny thing. Here's the troubling thing. Here's the frustrating thing. It just makes you grit your teeth. If you build the data system for the right-hand side, it will generate the data you need for the left-hand side. In fact, much higher quality, more complete data for the left-hand side if you invest in the right-hand side. So what you're doing is identifying those processes, identifying standard work, then using that as a map to say, what do we need to know to execute correctly on a routine basis? How do I make it transparent to the people who are delivering the care and the patients they serve directly? You see? On the other hand, if I invest heavily in the left-hand side, data for selection, it is not useful for improvement. Nearly never is it useful for improvement, even if I get lucky and I get a particular metric.
The NHS, Brent, we are so invested in that left-hand side. You know, we've got floors of data and analysts, and it's still very hard for clinicians to get what we need. Yeah.
You suck all the energy, you suck all the resources out of actual innovation, change, and improvement. You see, that's what happens. And so you kill your frontline teams. It means your basic model is right. You think the problem is a matter of motivation. How do I get those malingerers to show up and work well, right? And that is not the problem. Look at the evidence.
So my worry, I suppose, is as we come through the pandemic, is the things that we might keep are things like, oh, it's great to have virtual clinics, but underneath it, there are these, there are these building blocks, which is, data that enables us to make professional decisions, proper scrutiny of practice and teamwork. And so, that's the shift that what I'm seeing is people understanding the different relationship with citizens, definitely getting that. We need to be in an asset-based, collaborative, shared decision-making model. They get that. We need to change the way we do meetings so that we do them virtually like this, because it's so much more efficient. But some of these underlying building blocks I don't think are quite emerging yet in terms of us understanding why is it that this has worked well now.
So one thought, Becky, about that, a little bit of, here we go, let's get technical and run some numbers. It turns out that the virtual visits have to do with what's called acute self-limited disease. It's about half of a primary care practice. It's only about 10% of the total cost of care in most countries. About 45 to 50% of the cost of care is acute life-threatening disease, exacerbations of chronic illnesses that require hospitalization, major trauma, a heart attack, a stroke, those sorts of things. That's almost half of the cost of care. Fairly obviously, virtual visits won't work for a heart attack, right? It turns out you have to segment care delivery, and when you get those segments laid out, and then you see how big is each, and it changes your view of things like telehealth fairly profoundly.
But that means we've got
The
to
big
start
one,
with
and
need, not demand. And that's the next shift that we've got to make, which is
yeah, well,
what's
in the
what's
middle is
need.
chronic disease. In the middle is chronic disease, and that's about 25, maybe even 30% of all care is chronic disease. And what we're still struggling to develop are telehealth models that work for chronic disease management. I worked with a fellow from Walmart.
We've finally seem to have invented virtual ward rounds in care homes. Thank goodness. So at least there's some check-in every day, and there's some relationship building, which would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Rather than what, a more infrequent clinical relationship. So
what I'm trying to do is focus your efforts on that bucket.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where the real opportunities lie. That's where we're going to see some breakthroughs, I think. And that's where we need really innovative thought. So not so much telehealth for the, upper respiratory infection outside of COVID, and for a seasonal allergy, those sorts of things. Oh, that's fine. That's good. It's very transactional. They don't care who they see. When you get into chronic disease, you need a long-term relationship with a good clinical team.
Yeah.
I tried to help Walmart take their retail medicine model, right, and move it into chronic disease. And we struggled with that for 3 years without significant success. A very, very capable young physician leading it, a fellow named Daniel Epstein, amazingly smart, capable fellow, and still struggling. That's where the breakthroughs are going to come.
Yeah.
Is moving into that chronic disease model. A lot more money at play, a lot more clinical outcome opportunity at play in that model. And I just want to focus you on that bucket. So when you think telehealth, realize that it's not all the same.
So, we in our primary care system, we are working with general practice and saying, right, so on your list, how many people fall into that? How many people of those have also got some sort of socio-comorbidity, so they're poor? Well, what would that mean? And so you don't give everybody the same access. You have to differentiate your access. You have to differentiate your model for different groups of the population.
Right.
And I think that's really good to remind ourselves about that, actually, as a step to be thinking about now. That's really helpful.
Yeah, a real question though is you were given some breathing space, and sure enough, the natural ability of the NHS England, of the front line, has come surging forward, and it looks pretty good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And the real question you're asked is, moving ahead, COVID will pass, and a year or two we'll look back on it and forget the messy details and tell wonderful stories about how we lived through COVID. All right.
Learned to sing.
How do we keep the good from that? How do we not lose the good from it? It's the question you're really asking. Yeah. That's the challenge we face. That's where we need really people to step up and thoughtfully contribute. Yeah. It needs to change NHS England. Yeah. If it fails to change the nature of NHS England in a very positive way, we missed a real opportunity.
Well, I think we just had a window and said, do you know what? We can be a high-performing health system. We really can, and we can be overnight if we really want to be. So how come it's taking us years to cut our way little step by step there? I think it's a real challenge to say, is this where we want to be? And if we want to be, we've got to take responsibility for it.
Well, you do. Just do it. Yeah. Don't ask permission from Westminster. Just do it. Fly under the radar. Show up with the data and show them how it works. Right? They'll be flabbergasted. They won't know what to say. And in their confusion, it will give you time to do even more.
So now anybody watching that knows me, and possibly you, knows why we're friends. Because the subversive in both of us is a dangerous but also a wonderful part of our lives, and how we've managed to do what we've done. But very particularly, Brent, I so appreciate this time with you. I can't tell you. And I'm just delighted to see you again. Even this way is lovely. You're very good at it, which also helps. And it just reminds me that what we need at moments like this is generosity and love, and I always experience that from you. So thank you very much, Brent. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a delight as always. Just remember, if it's not fun, you're not doing it right.
That's a good note to end on.